my screen?
I am, that's great, yeah. So next up we've got Vanessa Braganza giving her talk First Impressions. So Vanessa is a book historian, literary critic at Harvard. She's best known for discovering and decoding the sole surviving book from Mary Wroth's library. Her writing has appeared in a range of academic and public venues, including Smithsonian Magazine, and is forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women Writers and the Palgrave Encyclopaedia of Early Modern Women's Writing. She's curating an exhibit opening at Harvard's Houghton Library in spring 2022 on women authors authorizing themselves. Today, Vanessa will be focusing on decorative bookbinding and specifically women's monograms.
Thanks so much for the intro, Lily.
All right, Vanessa, just grab your PowerPoint.
Well, let's get the PowerPoint up, yeah. All right, lovely. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I'll be talking about first impressions, impressive women, and impressionable skin. Women's literary and cultural activities throughout the 16th and 17th centuries are of many different complexions, but that's not how they're usually represented in early modern texts. Leave idle books alone, Edward Denny snaps at Lady Mary Wroth in 1621 when she publishes the Urania. For wise and worthier women have written none. He is a man in print, and 'tis enough he hath undergone oppressing, yet not like a lady. This is Anthony Scholliker, who in the early 17th century writes derisively of an author reluctant to appear in print. Some people will be familiar with this quotation. It opens Wendy Wool's monograph, The Imprint of Gender. Printing or pressing is a common sexual metaphor in this period, and it's always the woman's part to be pressed upon or imprinted by the man. We are gold in our own natures pure, but when we suffer, the husbands stamp upon us then, alas, and base ones of you men are mingled with us and make us blush like copper, says the character Maria in the play The Woman's Prize, John Fletcher's 17th century continuation of The Taming of the Shrew. This image combines the imagery of stamping an impression upon a precious metal with polluting it with impurities by mixing it with a base metal. So here's a question we should always be asking ourselves. How does the early modern period represent itself, impress itself upon our attention? A couple of takeaways from these quotes I've started with. Women shouldn't be writers, so says Denny, and women are the malleable sex or gender, the coin, the paper, whose role is to receive the physical and cultural imprint of men. Skin is a common metaphoric vehicle for this, and here doubles, right, with those printing and pressing metaphors and the coinage, the precious metal image as well of the stamped coin. Anyone who has ever enjoyed the sound of music will be thinking of the line, "Your life, little girl, is an empty page that men will want to write on." But we're one step further than that. Little girl, you are the empty page. Think back to Lily's quote from Othello with the word whore writ upon Desdemona. But understanding our period accurately depends on us driving a wedge between two questions. On the one hand, the question that I've already posed, how does the early modern period represent itself or impress itself upon our attention? On the other hand, how does this representation compare with what we can discern is actually going on in the period? Denny's remark is a good example, right? It doesn't ring with historical truth to us anymore. The past half century of scholarship has unearthed plenty of unwise women by his standard and will continue to turn up more women writers as time goes on. So this tells us something really important. The early modern period's impression of itself as regards gender is not to be taken at face value. As literary critics and historians, one of our most pressing tasks is to be able to distinguish between a period's impression of itself and the relationship of that impression to actual events. This is what I tell people constantly: question, 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 the way the period is presenting itself. So who is actually pressing or being impressed upon? So glad you asked. As it turns out, there are some impressive women in an area which heavily inflects both literature and history, but isn't actually often looked at. And it's also, fittingly enough, an area in which women are literally stamping their impressions on a different kind of skin: leather bookbinding. So your impression of leather bindings may well be that they're the work of men. Embroidered bookbindings are what women produce and deal in. After all, you all watched the video I pre-circulated on gold tooling. It involves workshop labor, not a domestic set of skills. And this sort of professional craftsmanship wasn't socially permitted women. Men do the pressing. Women's marks are found in the products of a sanctioned female activity. Next slide, please. Nope. This is a book penned by one woman and bound by another. Here's the backstory. After his fortunes plummeted following the collapse of the Virginia Company, and this is in 1626, businessman Nicholas Farrar, better known as George Herbert's literary executor, packed up his family and moved them to Little Gidding in Cambridgeshire, where they established a devout community organized around strict daily observance of the Book of Common Prayer. They also established a bindery staffed by Farrar's nephews and nieces, and actually instructed by a woman, a Cambridge bookbinder's daughter, as yet unidentified. The women in particular grew famous for their bindings. Thomas Fuller, contemporary writer, wrote in his book, The Worthies of England, 1662, that the so-called Little Gidding nuns, their needles were, quote, employed in learned and pious work to bind Bibles, end quote. For the longest time, modern bibliographers and book dealers interpreted needles, in this quote, to mean that the women were doing decorative needlework, embroidery. Here's the thing. Every extant confirmed book made by the Little Gidding bindery is leather. The needles were employed in actually stitching the quires together. This manuscript collection of extracts from scripture by Farrar's niece, Joyce Collett, was bound in olive morocco, that's goat skin, and tooled by his other niece, Joyce's sister, Mary Collett. I want you to look at this as more than an attractive piece of artistry. If we're going to get the right impression from this object, we need to look at the designs pressed into the leather as information to be deciphered. We need to know how to read these sorts of marks on skin. Here's some of the questions I start with when I first see a binding, and that I want you to ask yourselves as well, and possibly also in your groups. First, what does the style of the binding tell me about the object? This is what we call a centerpiece style. You can see it's organized around a central decoration, but it's made up of small tools, which is very in keeping with the 17th century influence of French luxury bindings, right? It's not just one piece of metal that's being pressed into the leather here, it's several, and I'm going to show that to you a bit later. So this is a very in fashion object, very in keeping with the French luxury binding styles of the time. What does that tell us? It's not a homespun object. It's not embroidered in the home. It's not made for personal use. The Little Gidding women, as Thomas Fuller's quote actually suggests to us, were very well known. They bound collages called harmonies. They bound books for Charles I, the Duke of York, and George Herbert as well. They were actually very well known, and they had an upmarket clientele. So question number one, what does the style tell me about the object? In this case, it says upmarket clientele. Question number two, do I see any inconsistencies here? Slide, please. So one thing to know about English binding, and more generally in this period, is that sometimes it has asymmetries and oddities of execution. You'll notice that around that central decoration, we have these dots, right, organized in what's supposed to be a diamond sort of lozenge shape. But you see the arrows pointing to one row of 4 dots that's angled slightly incorrectly. disrupts the diamond shape. That's actually very typical of English execution in this period, and it's not particularly female. John Bateman, royal bookbinder to Charles I, has similar awkwardnesses in his bindings with small individual tools. If you ask me during the general questioning, I'm happy to show you pictures of those. So do I see inconsistencies? Do any tools not match here? Maybe something has been tampered with. Is there anything here that's out of place? Is always a good question to ask. Next slide, please. And the last question, as I mentioned before, right, this is a binding that's organized around a centerpiece style, but uses many different pieces of metal. And this is now, will make sense to you from the video that you've already watched. This is made up of many individual pieces of metal pressed into the binding. It's a very labor-intensive kind of binding. We call it a semis binding, S-E-M-I-S, meaning made up of small tools. So the last question one asks of a binding is, how many decorative tools, how many actual pieces of metal can I tell were used to produce this? This gives you a sense of labor and skill, and here fairly obviously quickly dispels the idea that women were unskilled in a traditionally male trade. This is only, for there are many more, but I've highlighted 4 of the immediately obvious decorations here. You've got a spiral, you've got a diamond, we have leaves, we have a different kind of diamond design around the outer edge of the boards. Collections of tools can also help you to identify binders. So I don't actually think this has been done for the Little Giving binder, at least not in recent years, to identify what were the collection of tools. Can we consolidate the ornaments that they had in their workshop? Because that can help to identify future bindings by them. Slide, please. So I want to finish with an example that by now is probably familiar to many people in this audience, of a woman making her mark through a binding. I'm referring to one of my best friends in the rare book world, Lady Mary Wroth's monogrammed copy of Xenophon's Encyclopaedia. This is the same book I found a couple of years ago. In contrast to Like to the Indian, in which Roth uses the metaphor of skin color to represent the way that unreciprocated love is acting upon her, the monogram on this volume is actually Roth's way of using that same experience of being acted upon to make a reciprocal mark on others. The symbol decodes to the names Pamphylia and Amphilanthus, 2 of Roth's characters from her romance, The Urania. They're also fictional avatars for herself and her extramarital lover, William Herbert. On this book, bound after Herbert's death, the monogram also alludes to a 3rd character in The Urania named Fair Design, an allegorical knight who embodies both the monogram and her illegitimate son by Herbert, also named William. So the symbol and its literary reference here suggest that young William's features, first of all, may have borne the stamp of his father. He certainly bore the name of his father. And they also press the unwilling father figure together with the ending of the Urania to acknowledge or decode his son. So this is a way of using that physical impression on skin to signify maybe a visual echo between father and son, and to press the father to take a certain kind of action and lament the action not taken as well. Let's have one final turn of the slide. So I want to just leave you with a couple of questions for ways to move forward with this. What else, and I would love people to discuss this in the groups, what else might bookbindings change about our impressions, the impressions we derive of women's literary activity from the way this period represents itself? And then come at the same line of questioning from the other direction, what other impressions about women's literary activity do we take for granted, do we derive from early modern representations? What other methods might we use to question these? These might be book history, they might be other methods of historical investigation. So I'd love for people to think more about those questions as we go into the Q&A.